Here's a quote that most of you in citizen advocacy can identify with. It's by the American poet Maya Angelou. It goes like this: "You did then what you knew how to do. And when you knew better, you did better." End of quote. Better knowing will lead to better doing, you might say. Sound knowledge is a precursor to effective action. This session aims to explore the connective tissue of knowledge between the principles of citizen advocacy and the key activities of the CA office. Specifically, what I want to do is to look at each of the key activities sequentially and the principle or principles that inform implementation of the specific key activity. Of course, you could argue that one way or another, all of the principles have implications for all of the key activities. And that, I suppose, is probably true. But in this presentation, what I want to do is, with each key activity, examine which principles are particularly relevant. By way of a preamble, let me make a couple of points, though. The first point I want to make is that, at least for some of you, the thematic terrain I'll cover will be familiar to you. But for others, it may not be so. So please keep that in mind. The second and related point is that there'll be some overlap with material covered by previous presenters. So I hope you agree with me that overlap is better than to overlook. Now, at this juncture, rather than provide an overview of the principles and key activities, which has been done already by Zaina and others, I'll say more about them to a greater or lesser extent in the context and course of the presentation. I do, however, want to make some introductory comments about the principles and the key activities. According to the CAPE manual, there are 5 principles. Not everything in citizen advocacy is a principle or is derived from a principle. When we extend the use of a word like principle, we erode its meaning. The principles relate to the identity of the program. They are the identity barcode of citizen advocacy, if you will. The extent to which a program adheres to the principles will determine whether it is authentically citizen advocacy or a citizen advocacy tribute band. Just as not everything in citizen advocacy is directly associated with a principle, not every practice of the CA office is referred to as a key activity. For instance, the CA office may engage in general promotion or fundraising, which are activities, but they are not considered to be key activities. The CAPE manual describes 7 so-called key activities of the office. They have to do with arranging a match and supporting the match. The key activities then, as well as certain other associated practices, have to do with the quality of the work of the CA program. To recap, the principles are identity-related and the key activities are quality-related. For my benefit, I have found it useful to think of the principles as the road rules and the key activities as the road map. We need to know both the road rules of citizen advocacy and the way to get to the destination of a good match. There's little point in having a road map if we're driving on the wrong side of the road or running a red light. We need rules and we need direction. The crucial need for direction is captured in this excerpt from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. So Alice says, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. "So long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat. if only you walk long enough. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. With that backdrop, let's discuss how the principles guide implementation of the key activities. As I said, I want to sequentially go through the key activities, beginning with protégé recruitment. Protégé recruitment is the process of identifying and recruiting people in need of advocacy. A parenthetical point about the word protégé. In his 1973 text on citizen advocacy, Dr. Wolfensberger described the person matched with an advocate as the protégé, quote, for lack of a better term. For lack of a better term. Some people have substituted other words for protégé, including a few that are like language condiments. I don't know that those substitutes are better terms. So until a better term comes along, I'll keep using protégé, including in this presentation. The relevant principles that inform protégé recruitment are program independence and balanced orientation to protégé needs. Let's go firstly to balanced orientation to protégé needs. The key word is balanced. The CAPE manual states that the CA office should recruit protégés and advocates who represent a range of characteristics and needs. In particular, the office must pay attention to these four. Protégés with a wide range of ages, protégés who are limited in their ability to reciprocate, protégés who need spokesmanship, and protégés who need long-term relationships. First two are characteristics, the remaining two are needs. In recruiting protégés, if the office exclusively or predominantly relies on accepting referrals, it's unlikely to reach people that represent a wide spectrum of needs. And that will include people with some very significant needs. For example, an office that routinely takes referrals from service-providing agencies is not going to hear about service recipients who need strong spokesmanship. Why would the office be told? There's a strange kind of plausible deniability at play here on the part of the CA office. The office can say, we were not told about people who need strong spokesmanship, so we didn't know. And because we didn't know, we can self-exonerate for our inaction. All the while, the person lying in a fetal position in the corner of a dark room of an institution goes unnoticed and misses out on an advocate. To avoid that kind of scenario, the CA office can formulate an annual protégé recruitment plan, as you can see under the action-oriented recommendations on the column on your right. The first step in the process is to review the composition of current matches supported by the office. That kind of review will help in identifying protégé characteristics and needs that are overrepresented and underrepresented, and perhaps even unrepresented. For instance, the program may be top-heavy with matches that are friendship-based, and it may have proportionately few matches with protégés with a severe disability who are not able to reciprocate. Following the review, the office can proactively seek out those cohorts that are currently underrepresented or unrepresented. That way, the office can redress any imbalances in accordance with the annual protégé recruitment plan. Incidentally, I don't want to appear to be hard line on the practice of reaching for the low-hanging fruit of referrals. Low-hanging fruit isn't necessarily forbidden fruit. Some referrals are demonstrably legitimate. The issue here is to avoid an over-reliance on referrals in order to broaden the horizon of recruitment to reach people with different needs including high-intensity needs. Still on protege recruitment, let's look at the implications for the principle of advocate independence. Program independence means that the CA office must be independent of other parties and entities, including and especially services whose clients may be current or potential proteges. The independence of the program is undermined if the office is not in control of deciding whom it recruits as proteges. In other words, the office is habitually taking referrals. That is, in effect, outsourcing the responsibility of recruitment to other parties. If, for example, most of the referring is coming from service-providing agencies, then effectively, those agencies are controlling the direction and the very nature of the Citizen Advocacy Program. When the services refer their clients for friendship reasons, the CA program becomes a buddy program. If the CA office staff end up spinning furiously on the hamster wheel of referrals, working through a long waiting list, courtesy of the services, how can the program assert its independence by determining who is in need of advocacy? In the meantime, incidentally, the waiting list becomes the waiting forever list. In order to retain control of protege recruitment, the CA office should seek out people who need advocates, at least some of the time, and not imperil its independence by routinely accepting referrals, especially from human services. So that's on the right-hand column. If we can move on to the second key activity, recruiting people who will act as advocates. Here we need to consider the principles of advocate independence and balanced orientation to protege needs. Firstly, advocate independence. Advocate independence is built into the conceptual architecture of citizen advocacy. It is a given that the advocate doesn't receive any form of payment. The absence of payment, in the broad sense of the word payment, means a major conflict of interest is removed that would otherwise jeopardize advocate independence. But at the same time, the CA office needs to be aware of other dynamics that might also become obstacles to the advocate acting independently. For example, the nature of the relationships that the advocate has with other parties involved in the protege's life may be influential. An advocate who is an ex-service provider and whose protege is a recipient of the service that the advocate has left may still be reluctant to advocate against former colleagues because of residual allegiances. I have seen that happen. Accordingly, the CA office must recruit advocates who are able to act independently without the sorts of impediments that will compromise their advocacy. The principle of balanced orientation to protege needs must also be kept in mind in undertaking advocate recruitment, just as in protege recruitment. The CA office is required to recruit advocates who can assume a diversity of roles to complement protege characteristics and needs. The CAPE manual describes 3 dimensions of advocate role options. Roles may be formal or informal. Informal roles include guardian and adoptive parent. Roles may be instrumental or expressive, or a combination of the 2 aspects. And roles may be characterized according to the degree of demand inherent in the role. Demand or intensity of the advocacy role takes into account elements like stress, time, and other resources that might be expended by the advocate. Now, I'm not very good at maths, but if you count up all the potential advocacy roles, you'll find that there are as many as 15. In a similar fashion to devising a protege recruitment plan, the CA office must begin by reviewing the composition of current advocacy roles in its matches. That process will enable the CA office to identify which advocacy roles predominate, which roles are few, and which roles may be absent altogether. The findings then can then serve as the springboard to formulating an annual advocate recruitment plan to restore some balance in the range of advocacy roles. What's sometimes forgotten or overlooked by some citizen advocacy programs is that the annual advocate recruitment plan needs to be coordinated with the annual protege recruitment plan. The two recruitment plans must seamlessly go together. Some protege needs identified in the protege recruitment plan will organically point to the relevant advocacy role. For instance, if the CA office commits to recruiting one or more proteges who are non-reciprocal, that's the tick there, then one dimension of the relevant advocacy role for them is likely to be an instrumental-only role because reciprocity is not a consideration. Little ticks there, I hope you can see them. It could either be a formal instrumental-only role or an informal instrumental-only role. Next on the list of key activities is advocate orientation. Advocate orientation is preparation for the advocate to undertake the advocacy role. It typically covers a number of topics, including, most importantly, information about the protege. But for the purpose of this presentation, the two principles that are particularly relevant are advocate independence and clarity of staff function. Because advocate independence is central to the modus operandi of the advocate, the Citizen Advocacy Office must promote this principle in advocate orientation with an exclamation mark. It needs to be emphasized that the advocate remains loyal to the protege and acts independently of other parties. Those other parties include the CA office and especially agencies that provide services to the protege. The other significant principle is clarity of staff function. Particularly important here is the need for the Citizen Advocacy Office to clearly communicate what the role of the office is in relation to the role of the advocate. The CA office should clarify and confirm what the advocate can and can't expect from the office in its support of the advocate. That way, the office can minimize the possibility of having to put out fires subsequently because of any misunderstanding by the advocate. I'll say more about that point when we get to follow along and support. Key activity 4, the CA office must bring people together in a way that hopefully will lead to the formation of what we call a suitable match. In the context of advocate-protege matching, the relevant principle is balanced orientation to protege needs. To be clear though, the primary purpose of matching is to establish a suitable match, one that is responsive to protege needs. But here, we're concerned with the overall picture of balance in match demographics. That's important because, as mentioned earlier, it means a wide range of protege needs will be addressed by advocates recruited by the CA office. If the office is guided by the balanced orientation principle in protege and advocate recruitment, as we've discussed, then the matching process will organically lead to an expansive configuration of matches. Next, follow along and support. Follow along is about staying in touch, mostly with the advocate in the post-matching phase. Follow along is more about checking in with the advocate rather than checking up on the advocate. It's often a prelude to identifying and responding to the need for support. Support must be appropriate and proportionate. The right kind of support and the right amount of support. Support that is relevant and not too much and not too little. Finding that sweet spot isn't always easy, as many of you know. The pertinent principles are advocate independence and clarity of staff function. Let's look firstly at advocate independence. The follow-along and support provided by the office must be informed and constrained by the principle of advocate independence. That means the office must respect the independence of the advocate and of the match, and consequently support and not control the advocate. It is not the role of the office to be issuing papal edicts to the advocate about what should be happening in the match. The other principle at stake in providing follow-along and support is clarity of staff function. Consistent with the purview of the CA office, the staff provide support to the advocate and don't take on or take over the advocacy. The office is in the support role, not the lead. Ongoing training and advocate associates' emphasis are separate key activities. But in the context of this presentation, I think it makes sense to discuss them together. For these last two key activities, the applicable principles are advocate independence and clarity of staff function. Ongoing training events are advocate information sessions that are intended to be held periodically. The sessions typically focus on topics that have relevance to advocates and aim to inform and affirm them in their advocacy role. Advocate associates are recruited by the Citizen Advocacy Office, who serve as voluntary advisors to the advocates and sometimes the CA office. Depending on their background, advocate associates usually provide technical advice in a range of areas, most obvious examples being those of a legal or medical nature. In respect to these two key activities, it's not the role of the CA office staff to serve as the main provider of information and advice. Not that office staff could be all things to all advocates anyhow. Given the specialist nature of some of the information or advice that may be sought by advocates. Firstly, in regard to the principle of clarity staff function, the CA office is not the exclusive or primary source of some types of information and advice. Instead, the office links the advocates with relevant training and with advocate associates. As an example, one type of event that bridges these two key activities is to hold an advocate information session to which one or more advocate associates are invited so that they can talk about their role and meet the advocates. There's also a subtle danger that the CA office must be aware of concerning ongoing training and advocate associates. It's related to the principle of advocate independence. If the information is only or mainly coming from the office, it courts the danger that the staff will be seen by the advocates as the experts. Now, that may be good for the egos of office staff, but it's not good for advocate independence, because that sort of perception will weaken advocate independence, given the probability that the advocates will end up routinely deferring to the gurus from the office rather than acting independently of them. So the action taken by the office is the same as in the clarity of staff function principle. link advocates with appropriate training, and with advocate associates. Same action, but different principles are in play. Clarity of staff function before, advocate independence here. As a point of clarification, I should emphasize that I'm not talking about run-of-the-mill advice or perspective that the CA office staff may offer to the advocate and the course of providing follow-along and support. I'm not talking about that. In regard to these last two key activities, then, we can sum up the limits of the CA office with a salutary warning that the office is not the command and control center for everything. I hope that's not breaking news for anyone. Finally, in undertaking all of the key activities, and even the non-key activities, the office must never lose sight of the fifth principle, positive interpretations of handicapped people. I want to spend a bit of time on the implications of this last principle because I don't know that all CA programs pay sufficient attention to it, so indulge me. The CAPE manual cautions CA programs to be vigilant about the images they promote about protégés and other people with disabilities. We are reminded to avoid giving oxygen to images such as these. Images like these can be harmful to just about anyone, but they will disproportionately impact on people with disabilities who can bruise easily because of their state of heightened vulnerability. The actions of the CA office, whether intended or not, may amount to confirmation of pre-existing negative images and roles about protégés and others, because hardwired into the human identity is the unenviable trait of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is always on standby, waiting to be activated at the first opportunity. So it doesn't take much for our preconditioned attitudes to be confirmed. And on the other hand, evidence that contradicts a bias has to work doubly hard and overtime in order to successfully reverse the biased attitude. In implementing the key activities, the CA office has the challenge of not succumbing to the path of expediency that may do image harm to the protégés of the program. Take the example of advocate recruitment. In its advocate recruitment, can the office appeal to ideals like fairness and justice for people who need advocates, or is the office inclined to go for the petty charity angle of, quotes, help the poor people? The CA office may choose the petty charity approach if it's thought to be more effective in recruiting advocates. But then the office will have to grapple with its internal dialogue of cognitive dissonance, of responding to the siren song of match numbers at the expense of image damage to the protégés. Indeed, it would be a shame if the goals you kick turn out to be own goals ultimately. Here's a way of framing the positive interpretations principles as I understand it. Frame it. Firstly, I would argue that in all probability, at least some of the needs of any protégé will be image related. That is, regardless of other needs that the person may have, including more pressing needs. For instance, people with an intellectual disability, by virtue of having an intellectual disability, will unfortunately be image impaired. That is to say, their intellectual impairment leads to their image impairment, which creates image needs for them. The second point. Obviously, the primary mission of citizen advocacy is not to address the image needs of protégés of the program and other people with disabilities. Attitudinal change is not the main goal of citizen advocacy. It's not the main game. The purpose and purview of CA is to make a range of matches that advance the welfare of the protege, including matches that provide protection to the protege. But we must distinguish between protection of the protege and protection of the image of the protege. Protection of the protege, in a fundamental sense, is part of the mission of citizen advocacy. Protection of the image of the protege is embodied in this principle, positive interpretations. It's in the course of undertaking its mission that the CA office program should promote positive images and avoid or minimize negative images of proteges. Thirdly, a citizen advocacy program can do much about the imagery that emanates from its operation. It can't and shouldn't control all aspects concerning the image of proteges in the program. To try to do so would be to step outside its purview. For example, the CA office can't direct the advocate to ensure that the protege will dress appropriately. But the office can still influence many things that will impact on the image of proteges. To repeat then, there must be a heightened awareness of image issues, and that must be translated into avoiding negative images and promoting positive yet honest images of proteges and other people with disabilities. For example, the office can ensure that the topic is systematically covered in advocate orientation. Incidentally, John Armstrong and I have done a whole session on this theme for the CA study group based on what we call an image audit. Hopefully then, this presentation has been useful in connecting the conceptual and practical dots between the principles and the key activities. I now turn to my conclusion, but in doing so, I want to raise a tangential point that is nonetheless related to the topic. I want to say something about the falsehoods that exist about citizen advocacy, and then make the link to our topic. As many of you know, the landscape of citizen advocacy has become a minefield of falsehoods. Everything from CA is a buddy program to advocates are unhinged, unaccountable cowboys. Sadly, some CA programs themselves hold self-detonating devices in that minefield. At any rate, falsehoods about CA have a way of spreading easily. As the satirist and author Jonathan Swift wrote in 1710, falsehood flies and truth comes limping after it. You may have heard variations of that original line. A few years ago, Brian Earp, a scientist, expressed his frustration at the difficulty of having to correct the record on false claims made in the name of science. He wrote about it in an article which he eloquently titled, "The Unbearable Asymmetry of Bullshit." I'm not making this up, you can look it up. What is he talking about? Why asymmetry? What's asymmetrical? Here's what he means, and I quote, "In this essay, I discuss the problem of plausible sounding bullshit in science, and I describe one particularly insidious method for producing it." And this is the next part is about asymmetry. Because it takes so much more energy to refute bullshit than it does to create it. And because bullshit can be so damaging to the integrity of empirical research. And he goes on. This is a cautionary message for us if we analogize and situate the message in the context of citizen advocacy. Some programs, at least, find that they have to constantly fight a rearguard action against CA falsehoods. That can be energy sapping and asymmetrical, to use Brian Earp's word. One way to rebut falsehoods about citizen advocacy is to send the right message about our work in the first place, and what we say and in what we do. That requires understanding the grammar of citizen advocacy. Among other things, it means that we need to clearly understand the principles and the key activities and be able to draw a through line from one to the other. That may require revisiting them repeatedly. In the process, the lightning bolt of epiphany can strike and reveal even more of an already familiar scene. As Dr. Wolfensberger has said, we can keep learning from what we already know. End of quote. When we know better, we can do better. And we can all do better. Thank you.